Most conversations end without anyone knowing they were the last one. You say goodbye the way you always have. Maybe you're distracted. Maybe your mind is already on something else, dinner, a phone call you need to return. The small logistical weight of an ordinary afternoon. You don't linger. You don't try to memorize the sound of someone's voice or the specific words they chose, or the way they paused before answering something simple. Why would you? There's always tomorrow. There's always another call, another Sunday dinner, another quiet moment to say the things that felt too heavy for a Tuesday. Nancy Guthrie didn't know her last conversation was coming, and the people who loved her had no idea they were about to lose her. But that conversation happened, and according to those familiar with the investigation, the exchange that took place between Nancy and her son-in-law in the final hours, before everything changed, carried details that investigators would later describe as deeply significant. Words were spoken, a tone was established, and somewhere inside what was said, and perhaps more powerfully, inside what was carefully not said, there was a thread, one that, when investigators began pulling it slowly and methodically, started to unravel something that had been holding a very deliberate shape for a very long time. Investigators don't reach for the word significant without a reason. It isn't a filler word. It isn't the kind of language that appears in a serious investigative record just to fill space. When it surfaces in the context of a missing persons case, it means something specific and consequential, a direction confirmed, a suspicion deepened, a timeline that finally locked into place in a way it hadn't been able to before. Something shifted because of this. Something was understood differently. Whatever passed between Nancy and her son-in-law in that conversation, its weight did not fade with the passing days. According to those close to the case, it only grew. There's a particular kind of trust that doesn't announce its own arrival. It doesn't come from a single moment of decision or commitment. It builds through the slow, unnoticed accumulation of ordinary time, shared meals, familiar voices, the comfortable repetition of someone simply being there, reliably and without drama, until their presence stops being something you consciously register. It becomes part of the background, part of the texture, part of what makes a house feel like home and a family feel like safety. That kind of trust is the deepest kind, and it is, when it turns out to have been misplaced, the most devastating thing a person can discover about their own life. Nancy Guthrie had lived inside that kind of trust for years. She was a woman rooted in her world the way genuinely contented people are, not performing ease, but actually inhabiting it. Her home was a place people came to without needing an invitation. Her presence in a room had a quality that's hard to describe, without sounding like you're reaching for something that doesn't translate into ordinary language. A steadiness that made the people around her feel, simply by being near her, that the situation, whatever it was manageable, that things would be all right. That quality is rare in people, and it tends to leave an absence that reshapes everything around it when it's suddenly and completely gone. Her family was the center of everything. Her daughter, her grandchildren, the extended circle of people that a life, carefully and lovingly maintained over many years, naturally draws close. Her son-in-law had been inside that circle for long enough to have moved from newcomer to fixture. He sat at the table. He showed up for the occasions that mattered and the ones that didn't. He was present for the unremarkable moments that quietly stitch a family together, the kind that nobody documents because they seem, at the time, too ordinary to be worth preserving. He knew the house. He knew the rhythms. He knew Nancy in the way that you come to know someone not through any particular act of attention, but simply through the accumulated weight of enough shared time. That knowledge, according to investigators, would matter later in ways that nobody standing inside those ordinary moments could possibly have anticipated. When Nancy disappeared, the people who loved her didn't reach for fear immediately. Fear comes after confusion, and confusion arrived first. The entirely reasonable human assumption that there was an explanation, that she had stepped out, that the calls going unanswered and the messages sitting unread had some ordinary cause that would surface shortly and make everyone feel mildly embarrassed for worrying. Families are built to extend that kind of benefit of the doubt. It isn't naivety. It is love doing what it has always done. protecting the people it belongs to from the worst possibilities for as long as it possibly can. But the explanation didn't come. The hours moved, and the calls continued going unanswered, and the doors continued staying closed, and the fear that had been held at bay by hope began to rive in full. Quietly and without any particular warning, law enforcement was contacted. A formal search began, and according to reports, investigators found themselves drawn almost immediately to a detail that people outside the investigation wouldn't have understood the significance of, at least not yet. A conversation, a specific exchange, words spoken between Nancy and her son-in-law in the period just before the world she lived in stopped being what it had always been. Words that, taken on their own, in any other context, might have dissolved into the background noise of a normal family interaction, without leaving a trace. Words that, understood in the full light of what came after, carried considerably more meaning than anyone who heard them at the time could have known to look for. This is the story of that conversation, what was said inside it, what it quietly revealed, and why the people investigating Nancy's disappearance have described it, according to reports, as one of the most important pieces of the entire case. The thing about lives that are built with real care and lived with genuine warmth is that they rarely look dramatic from the outside. There are no obvious turning points or visible fault lines. There is simply the patient, steady accumulation of days that matter deeply to the people living them, even if they wouldn't register as significant to anyone looking in from a distance. Nancy's life was like that, rich in the ways that resist documentation, full in the ways that only become visible after the fullness has been removed, and the shape it left behind is all that remains. She had her routines in the personal, unhurried way that people develop when they've had the freedom to structure their lives around what genuinely matters to them. Mornings that started without urgency, a pace that didn't bow to pressure, time with the grandchildren that was protected, not because she felt obligated to protect it, but because those hours were simply the part of her week she looked forward to most. She made space for the people she loved deliberately, not because it was expected of her, but because that was who she was. Her son-in-law had been close enough to this life for long enough to understand its rhythms, without ever needing them explained. This is what proximity does. Over time, it fills you with details you didn't consciously set out to gather. You know when someone is likely to be home. You know which part of their property faces away from the street. You know the name of the neighbor they talk to and the one they don't. You know their schedule not because you studied it, but because you were simply present, while it repeated itself, over and over, across years of ordinary days. None of this feels like information while it's accumulating. It only becomes information under very specific circumstances, when someone begins to think about how it could be used. According to reports, investigators spent significant time in the early stages of the case, doing exactly this kind of mapping, tracing who had detailed knowledge of Nancy's life, how precise that knowledge was, and how it could only have been obtained. The picture that emerged from that mapping pointed consistently toward a very short list of names, people with sustained access, people who had been inside the circle long enough for the details to have become second nature. The son-in-law was near the top of that list, but none of that had broken the surface yet. From the outside, in the period leading up to Nancy's disappearance, there was nothing that would have caught anyone's attention. The family appeared functional. The relationships appeared intact. Whatever had been building in the spaces between ordinary interactions, whatever pressures or intentions or carefully managed distances had been accumulating beneath the visible surface of things had not yet announced itself, and then a conversation happened, and the shape of everything that came after it was decided. Investigators became aware of the conversation, according to reports, through the accounts of people who had been either partially present during it, or who had spoken with Nancy in its immediate aftermath. In both cases, something had registered. Not alarm, not the specific, urgent quality that makes someone reach for a phone and call for help. Something quieter and harder to name. A quality to what Nancy said, or the way she said it, or the things she left unspoken, that the people who knew her well recognized as being slightly misaligned with who she normally was. Nancy was not, by any account, a woman who wore her concerns externally. She didn't process worry out loud or reach for other people. When something was sitting uneasily with her, her instinct was to hold things internally, to turn them over in the privacy of. The emotional register wasn't right. When someone loses a person they love, the memory of the last exchange they had with them tends to develop a particular texture. Compulsive, raw, full of the details that grief keeps returning to, because the mind is looking for the signs it missed. His account, according to those familiar with the investigative record, lacked that quality entirely. It was too composed, too organized, too smooth to have come from someone genuinely working through the loss of a person they cared about. There were also factual inconsistencies, specific details about timing that other accounts contradicted, characterizations of how Nancy had seemed, her mood, her demeanor, what she appeared to be thinking about, that didn't align with what others, who had been in contact with her around the same time, reported seeing. His version of the conversation, when placed directly alongside the other versions, did not hold its shape. Investigators documented each of these inconsistencies carefully, and they documented something else, a specific phrase, according to reports, that surfaced in the son-in-law's account, a phrase that drew attention not because it was overtly incriminating, but because it referenced something that, according to the accounts of the other people present during the conversation, had not actually been said. Information that pointed toward a knowledge of subsequent events that, if the established timeline was accurate, he simply should not have possessed. That phrase reportedly brought the review to a stop. It was the kind of moment that patient, serious investigative work produces occasionally, quiet, unannounced, and unmistakable to anyone paying the right kind of attention. Questions were raised. As of this account, they remain officially unanswered. There is a category of evidence that is harder to present in formal proceedings than physical evidence, but that experienced investigators consistently describe as among the most revealing available to them: the evidence of deliberate silence, the carefully placed gaps, the moments where a direct question produces a response that is technically an answer, but is engineered to give nothing real away, the specific topics around which someone's language suddenly becomes vague and circuitous, when everything else in their account has been precise. This pattern has a texture that investigators learn to recognize. It feels different from the ordinary imprecision of human memory, and different again from the confusion of genuine shock. As investigators deepened their engagement with the son-in-law, according to reports, that texture began to emerge with increasing consistency. He was cooperative in the way that covers a great deal of ground, without actually yielding much of it. He was present. He answered. He did not refuse contact or reach for protections that would have drawn immediate attention. But in the places where his answers should have been specific, they became vague. In the moments where his account of the last conversation should have been most vivid, because grief, when it is real, produces vividness, it became instead the smoothest and most featureless part of everything he said. According to reports, investigators also began hearing from people in the family's wider social circle during this period. People who had been in contact with the son-in-law around the time of Nancy's disappearance, and who had their own memories, their own moments of quiet unease that had never found an occasion to be spoken aloud. What some of them reported, according to accounts, connected directly back to the last conversation, things he had said to others in the days before Nancy disappeared, and in the days immediately after, that suggested an awareness of events that his official account should not have accommodated. Details that placed him closer to the center of what had happened than adjacent to it. The investigation had moved, by this point, into a different kind of work. Not the work of building a case from nothing, but the patient, methodical work of confirmation, of placing each piece carefully alongside the others until the picture they form together becomes impossible to honestly misread, and threading through all of it, according to reports, was the conversation, those last words, the exchange that Nancy experienced as an ordinary interaction and that her son-in-law, investigators have reportedly come to believe, experienced as something entirely different, as a final gathering of the information he needed, framed in the language of family and spoken in the tone of an ordinary Tuesday. The asymmetry in that, between what she understood when she spoke and what he may have already known when he listened. is the detail that those closest to this investigation describe, consistently, as the most difficult part of the whole case to carry. Cases that turn on a conversation carry an evidentiary challenge. That doesn't exist with physical evidence. A fingerprint doesn't shift in memory over time. A conversation does. It lives in the minds of the people who were part of it, filtered through emotion and time, and the specific distortions that accompany real grief, real fear, and the pressure of formal questioning. None of this makes conversation worthless as evidence. It makes it something that has to be built carefully, gathered from multiple sources, cross-referenced patiently, and interpreted with an honest understanding of what it can and cannot bear. Investigators working this case have done that work, according to reports. Multiple accounts gathered and placed alongside each other. Inconsistencies noted and followed. The specific phrase documented and analyzed in the context of everything else that was known. The timeline mapped and remapped until the version that holds together under scrutiny became clear. What has emerged is not a single, isolated exchange, but a conversation that sits inside a much larger pattern, one that derives its significance not from any one element, but from the accumulation of everything surrounding it. For the people living inside this story, the conversation carries a weight that operates differently from investigative significance. For Nancy's daughter, the possibility that the last exchange her mother had with her husband may have been something other than what it appeared that it may have been, in some fundamental sense, a performance designed to serve a purpose rather than a genuine human exchange, is the kind of knowledge that rewrites everything around it. It asks her to return to every interaction she witnessed, every exchange she was told about, every moment of apparent warmth or normalcy, and hold each one against a different and harsher light. That is not a clean process. It doesn't produce simple answers or neat resolutions. It produces something messier and more enduring, a deep uncertainty about what was real and what was constructed, about which memories of a person she thought she knew can be trusted, and which ones need to be reconsidered from the beginning. For investigators, the psychological portrait that has taken shape through this case of someone capable of conducting a conversation with a precise informational purpose while maintaining the outward presentation of ordinary family interaction is one they describe, according to reports, with a seriousness that reflects how rarely they encounter it. It points toward a level of premeditation and controlled performance that those who study this kind of behavior recognize as genuinely significant and genuinely rare. No official conclusion has been reached. The matter remains under investigation. What has been established, according to those familiar with the case, is that the conversation was not ordinary, that the words spoken inside it carry meanings that only surfaced fully in the light of what came after, that the investigation has been built substantially around understanding exactly what was said, and why it was said, and what it tells investigators about the person who chose to say it. Nancy's last conversation did not end the way last conversations are supposed to end. It didn't carry the softness of an unknowing goodbye. According to everything investigators have assembled, it had a purpose running beneath its surface, an intention, a direction that one person in that exchange had already chosen, long before the words were spoken. That is the detail that stays with everyone who has spent time inside this case. The conversations we remember most clearly are almost never the ones we expected to remember. They're the ones that meant something entirely different from what we understood at the time. The ones that only became legible in the rearview mirror of everything that came after. The ones that, if we had known what we know now, we would have held onto differently, listened more carefully, read more honestly, responded to with the attention they deserved rather than the inattention that normalcy encourages. Nancy didn't know. She had no reason to know. She moved through that conversation the way she moved through all of them openly, without defenses, trusting in the straightforward way that people trust when nothing in their life has yet given them a reason not to. She answered the questions because they were questions from family. She spoke without calculating what her words might be used for, because that is not how she experienced the world. She had not been built for that kind of wariness. It wasn't a flaw. It was precisely what made her who she was. That not knowing is the most painful part of this story, and also the most human. She was not naive. She was simply still living in the version of her life that hadn't yet been broken. The people she told, the ones who registered something slightly off in the account she gave of the conversation, who noticed her unease without knowing how to name what was causing it, have